Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege that you would join me here today for a presentation on how not to let issues prevent relationships. I'm Chad Lekeys. I serve at Lutheran Hour Ministries, and I'm just going to barrel right into this. We may have a few more folks coming on in, but we'll look here and not there so they don't feel embarrassed for being a little behind. Those desserts are good. They take a while. And the social time is so critically necessary. And I want to talk about our social environment, our social context, because I think what's happening right now is that we are letting issues prevent relationships, even in the church. And one of the reasons this is important to me is because at Lutheran Hour, one of the things we try to do is help church professionals, lay people, anyone who's part of the priesthood of all believers talk about their faith. We equip them, we use research-based materials, we've got tools that we have built out of that research. A lot of people have received it very well, but they back me up and ask, so how do I talk about my faith in an age when I run into someone who harbors a difference from me that's significant, perhaps about religion, but perhaps about any other thing, politics, race, guns, abortion, climate, you name it, on and on and on. And it's almost as if there seems to be a social imperative that's pressing on all of us. We're immersed in it in a variety of ways, and I'll try to give an example in a minute, that says something like, I can't talk to someone who doesn't share my same deepest convictions. In fact, I have to dissociate. So this is like a prior problem. If I want to equip people to talk about their faith, they feel uncomfortable even being able to do that, as if we've got to solve this relational issue of we've got to fix our ideological differences first before we can have other conversations. I want to argue just the opposite. I want to argue that Jesus never let an issue prevent relationship. He never let an issue prevent a relationship. And because Jesus lives in you and me, this is a way that we can live out and embody His life in me, shine His light in the world, especially in our really dark times that we're hopefully emerging out of. But these social problems have become so exacerbated in the last 2 years, I don't think they're going to go away nearly as quickly as we might forget about a global viral pandemic. Let me start with this. 93%, that is how many people in our culture hate how divided we are. They're frustrated about it, they're exhausted by it, but they don't know what to do about it. 93%. That's like all of us, for the most part. I don't know any social statistics that ever achieve this, right? Other than maybe the modest unity of, well, we all want clean water to drink, or something like that, right? What's fascinating is the irony of this. We all agree about just how bad it is that we're experiencing so much disagreement. Do you see that? The irony. This comes from the Hidden Tribes Report, ran in 2018. It's possible that number might be just a little bit higher after the last couple of years. And they try to break this down in a couple of ways, and I want to add a little more to that. First of all, we can name the issues we're divided about. It was in my description of the session. I don't know that we need to reiterate that, but I think we could probably fill a whole slide and many more about the things that we find reason to deeply disagree about and dissociate as a result. Online, we're immersed in an environment where we hear a lot of voices. There is quite a bit of noise on the farthest poles, right and left, the extreme sides of any issue that are the loudest. 80% of all tweets on Twitter come from those polls. That counts for about 10% of all people using Twitter. So 5% on each end accounts for 80% of all tweets. And the rest of us, if you're on Twitter, are in the 20%. Right? Think about it this way. This is new from Pew Research. This is challenging to read because it's a lot of data on one side. But notice here, here's the extreme left, and here is the extreme right. So these are those who turned out to vote at higher rates than any other typology groups. The most here and the most here. And then same on social media, the most here and the most here. Same here and here and here and here. Right? So it is those on the extremes that have the loudest voice, which everyone is paying attention to, which churches are fearful of in some sense, right? We don't want the newspaper in our local city to be talking about us. At a university I used to work at, I served at Concordia Portland, we didn't like the newspapers talking about us. They didn't get our issues, but they blew them out of proportion, and they got the public to start piling on. This is one of the ways that social media is working. This is happening amongst many of our youth, right? All of them are self-censoring. They're stopping talking. They're not sharing their own positions because they're afraid not of what any of us grown-ups or their teachers might think, or their pastors, or however you serve in their life. They're afraid of what their peers are going to think. This was the same in my classroom. It was very difficult for me to get them to talk because they didn't want anybody to pile onto them. And what have we done, right? Amongst these social divisions, we have created a new sector of society almost. The Me Too movement, for example, I think was very good at raising the voices of those who've suffered any sort of sexual abuse, right? And we could talk about a variety of them. But what was a very bad outcome was now we've got this whole sector of people who were victimizers, but now are the irredeemable of society. We have voted them off the island. And even we Christians experience this, participate in it. Even we who have been forgiven, even we whose Savior died on the cross while we were still his enemies, even we still consider some sins to be unforgivable. And we struggle with this and wrestle with this. Sometimes we're out there on the polls. In the middle might be that 93%-ish, right? Hidden Tribes talks about these groups as being the exhausted and often silent majority. Like my students, probably like many of you, we don't share. We don't engage in conversations where someone might dislike what I'm thinking. We're exhausted. We're frustrated. How did this come about? Really quickly, I just want to say that this social polarization in which we live is a learned habit. David Kinnaman's research in Faith for Exiles, he argues that the most powerful discipleship mechanism that exists in our culture is this thing, right? He talks about it this way. I'll go through that infographic in just a second. But he says, even using conservative estimates, the typical young person spends nearly 20 times more hours per year using screen-driven media than taking in spiritual content. For the typical young churchgoer, the ratio is still more than 10 times as much cultural content as spiritual intake. Of course, that book was all about younger generations, those who are leaving the church, Faith for Exiles, and he's wanting to think, what's the difference between those who are leaving and those who stay, and figure out a resilient faith. There's no reason to take pictures of my slides because I've already shared them on the Whova app, so your privilege, just go ahead and listen. So what's going on here? This is a really fancy infographic, but basically this is all the hours of non-spiritual content that we can consume. Right? And for the normal person, they're down here consuming this much spiritual content out of all of this, 20 times less. And for the normal churchgoer, it's only a little bit more. So when you think about discipleship, you think about the environment in which you're immersed, where you spend the most time. It has the most influence on shaping who you are. You start to repeat what you see other people do, and that's exactly what we've done. We've been formed by polarization. We learn how to engage others by watching how others do so. Arthur Brooks used to run the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative political think tank. He now teaches at Harvard in leadership and psychology. His main area is the study of happiness. But he wrote a fascinating book a handful of years ago called Love Your Enemies. I often like to talk for a while I was a professor about civil dialogue. I thought that was important. Brooks pushed me to think further, because he finally brought a very Christian voice into this conversation. He's a Catholic, and he said, our call as Christians is to love our enemies, perhaps the hardest thing we are called to do as Christians. But I thought he was exactly right in pushing my thinking past just being civil, just being nice, just being friendly. We can do better. But in giving an analysis of where we are, he started to talk about this immersive environment in which we spend our time as the outrage industrial complex. That might ring in your ears from Eisenhower's famous speech, the military-industrial complex, as he was coming out of his presidency. He warned us against this, and many people have played on this phrase. But the basic idea is there seems to be, we experience it this way, a mechanical generation of more and more outrage and anger, especially in various forms of mass media. Social media, particularly, but the 24-hour news channels, pick your poison. They're all doing it in some way. He says, in an age of outrage, polarization, and anger, what do we see exhibited most? Brooks calls it contempt. He borrows from the mid-1800s philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who defined it as the unsullied conviction of the worthlessness of the other. The unsullied conviction of the worthlessness of the other. Man, I don't want to be guilty of that, but I think on a number of occasions I have been. The culture in which we're immersed, it's not out there, it's affecting all of us. It's not something that's objectively different, something that we can influence or control. It's something that maybe we have interfluence on. It's pushing on us as much as we might be pushing back on it, but we can't escape it. Culture is often, I think, best defined as the water we swim in or the air we breathe. We don't notice it, right? And if we live in a culture of contempt, it's not hard then to go down the road to say, I'm probably being formed and shaped to be a contemptuous person at times. From our tradition, being German, I like the word Schadenfreude because sometimes I'm more guilty of this than contempt, right? Getting satisfaction from someone else's misfortune. That is like a painful thing to admit, right? We can have a confessional moment here. I can absolve you. But we've got to grapple with this before we can move forward. Contempt, Schadenfreude, are troublesome issues that come out of our fallenness. They don't have to. There are better ways. So I want to break down the rest of this talk by saying there are 4 challenges that we face and 4 approaches for dealing with them. The first one is ideological difference, perhaps the biggest one, the reason we dissociate. I can't talk to you because your deepest convictions aren't my deepest convictions, right? Somehow, because you're different, you're morally bad, contaminated, or something like that. We can't associate. React before understanding. We assume motivation far more often than we ought, and in many situations, antagonism shapes others' perceptions of us. I'm going to spend the most time on the first one because I think it's the most difficult to walk through. I want to talk about ideological differences in the sense that, borrowing from Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, he talks about the ties that bind and the ties that blind. Okay, the ties that bind and the ties that blind. Group identity, I think many of us probably know this in a common sense way, is formed in part by shared ideas, right? They are the ties that bind. It can be as simple as, the church softball league or the bowling team that you used to be on, or joining together as the church, or being a fan of the Michigan Wolverines. Right, David? All right. These are the ties that bind. They can be trivial, or they can be really super stinking important, right? Some of our deepest convictions are part of the ties that bind, right? Our confession that Jesus Christ is Lord, for example. I'll talk about that again in a minute. But group identity, when formed by ties that bind, can also have ties that blind, right? It can be intoxicating, such that we stop critically questioning what we're taking in. Errors then can creep in, and we're predisposed to start to assume that outsiders are wrong or bad or evil or going to hell or however we want to describe it. I'll give you an example. 20 or so years ago, on NPR, a man was interviewed who had just left a white supremacy cult. And I think a lot of listeners were expecting to hear the interview go in such a way that the man was going to start to tell his story and reveal how he was convinced, right? How he deliberately and rationally, using his reason and his powers of critical thinking, suddenly recognized that he completely believed the wrong thing. But listeners were treated to nothing like that. Rather, they were treated to a story that was full of emotion and completely about his affect, his feelings. It was more of a gut sort of thing than a head sort of thing. And this is the story he told. He was at a rally where the leader of the cult was, making this powerful, moving speech about the security of the white race and moving forward with their ideological agenda. And as he's going on, he starts to talk about people who aren't just outsiders to the white race, but even within those he called defectives, people that might have so-called birth defects, for example. Or we could name others. You could go back to the eugenics movement. It happened even in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. But as the man was talking about these defectives, he started to name particular birth defects. And one of them was those who have the condition of cleft palate. And when the man heard that words, he was an instant convert from being a white supremacist because his daughter was someone who had the condition of cleft palate. And he realized that the ties that bind also blinded him. His commitments were out of order. Up until that point, his commitment to the cult was higher than his commitment to love for family, love of his own blood kin. But when he heard it, it flipped, and his priorities went the other way. And only through that experience, it was what the philosopher Slavoj Žižek calls an eruption of the real for him. An experience where reality pushed back in such a way that you couldn't deny it and you couldn't turn away from it. I think that's probably one of the only ways of coming out of ideology. You have to have an experience. It's very unlikely that you can ever be argued out of it. The more arguments, the more evidence you put forward to someone who is stuck within an ideology from our perspective, the more they are going to get entrenched in their original position. This is proven over and over again by psychological and sociological research. I'm just going to encourage you, don't try it. Don't. You're going to be frustrated. And you're going to wonder, you're going to want to shake them like, what's wrong with you? And that's part of the problem. That is a way of living out contempt. Does that make sense? All right? So let me keep going just a little bit. The ties that bind are also deeply important to us, as I mentioned. Right? As Christians, we have, for example, the Lutheran confessions in our tribe, the Lordship of Christ in our tribe. But those can also be just as much for the white supremacist as for us, ties that blind. So we get entrenched in us versus them, insider and outsider debates. Right? Lutherans are always right. We've got the purest doctrine, right? Okay. How about this? All of us are at best practices. Does that mean we're the cool kids, the righteous ones in the Missouri Synod? Yes. Don't go there, my friends. That's the culture of contempt, right? That we don't want to embody. I'm trying to show you, though, how very easily this can happen, right? Michigan State versus the Michigan Wolverines. It can happen over trivial things. What's happening in our culture right now, in terms of the ties that bind and the ties that blind, entire families are being broken apart. Divorces are happening. Friendships are being lost. People are leaving your churches. We then devolve into a kind of tribalism, and there's plenty of that in our church body, but we see plenty of it in our culture. I often think of our own church body as a microcosm of what's going on in the wider American culture. Let them in if they want to come in. Oh, he's just counting. So tribalism might be something like the confessionalists versus the congregation together people versus the contemporary worshipers versus the traditional worshipers versus those who aren't at best practices versus those who are. Do you feel me? I could make up a whole bunch of other ones. We've manufactured them. We've decided that these things matter. And we judge one another on the basis of which camp we fit in. And then if you're an outsider to whatever I think is right, it's so very easy then for me to consider you bad, evil, stupid, going to hell, whatever.
Something that needs to be fixed.
Indeed. So what do? How do we get behind ideological differences? Brooks advises what I just advised a moment ago. Contempt makes persuasion impossible. No one has ever been hated into agreement. No one has ever been hated into agreement. After all, no one's ever been hated into agreement after all. So its expression is either petty self-indulgence, right, where I can wave my flag if I'm on the right side of history and others can see it, or cheap virtue signaling, which in many ways does the same thing. Neither of which wins converts. It just entrenches people further. I think ideologies and breaking out of them, it's better to describe, they don't often happen because you've rationally argued a person into seeing their error. They've got to have this eruption of the real moment, where you're like Wile E. Coyote, who's run off the cliff, is suddenly hanging out there in midair, and looks up and looks at the viewer, and you realize he's wondering, what the hell am I doing? They've got to have that moment, and you can't make it happen, right? They've got to experience it on their own. It's not something that we can force as much as we want to. So I would say we can't bridge ideologies. We can't reconcile them, but that doesn't mean we can't have relationships with these people. Do you feel me? All right. I'm going to take this minute to toss you a handful of these, because this is something I want to keep in your head, right? Bridge relationships, not ideological gaps. Remember that we're trying to have a relationship with persons so somebody might meet Jesus in me, right? I'm not here to convince you of whatever wrongness I think you have. Maybe we'll get to that point along the way, but very likely maybe we won't. We live in a fallen society that won't be over until Jesus returns and brings about the consummation of all things. Are you with me? Right. So this sin thing is going to make it messy. That doesn't mean relationships are impossible. They very much are. So take some of these, pass them around. And as you write notes to friends or notes for yourselves, you can remember how you're trying to relate to others. In particular, those difficult folks that you don't know how to relate with.
I'll take over.
You're the man. So let me keep going. Focus on bridging divides. How do we do that? We can think about what we have in common. Like I said a few moments ago, John Anaziu, a legal scholar at Washington University in St. Louis, has said, despite the deep differences in American culture, we still do live out a modest unity. All of us like clean water. I grew up in Michigan. I think everybody in Michigan would love to have good roads. They don't, but I think we would love if they did, right? We want accessible health care, for example, right? We want the opportunity for a good education. And we can share other things, right? The so-called trivial things. I'm a fan of the Detroit Lions, right? You might think I'm silly, but I live with the religious eschatological hope that someday in my lifetime, the Lions will achieve something. And that is a way that we can relate with one another, right? Just on the basis of something we share, right? I might be doomed, but somebody else can be doomed with me, and we can commiserate in our doomedness, right? This doesn't neglect disagreement, however. It simply aims to disagree better. Right? To disagree better. The disagreement doesn't break the relationship. The disagreement can only happen in relationship. Right? So let me tell you about Daryl Davis. I usually run a video at this point, but I want to save just a little bit of time. Daryl Davis is an African American. He is a musician, a lecturer, and a civil rights leader in our day. He has a documentary on Netflix called Accidental Courtesy. I encourage you to look it up. But in that documentary, he tells the story about how he makes friends with members of the KKK. And he asks them a very simple question. Why would you want to kill me without even knowing me? And people look at him in that very same sense that I described at the beginning. Why would you even talk to this person? Why do you even associate with them? As if the automatic mode and response should be dissociation. Instead, he creates a relationship. And then he says, I never set out to convert anybody. But somehow along the way, some of them ended up converting themselves. Right? They realized that he was a human like them. The difference might have been the color of their skin, their life experience, and a great many other things. But he was a person like them. And it was a huge, moving visual example for me. And I could give you a handful more, but I really want to keep going. So that is the trouble of ideology and how we handle it and react. I'll try to move through the rest of these more quickly. We've got a bad habit of reacting before understanding. An important book for me has been Alan Jacobs' How to Think. A little bit pretentious of a title, but if you can read that subtitle at the top, A Survival Guide for a World at Odds, he's really trying to speak into this moment for helping us relate to each other. And one of the things he talks about in the very beginning of the book is a bad habit that many of us have, which he calls refutation mode, where you'll be listening to someone like me, for example, or watching the news, or maybe hearing, reading something on social media. It could be anything. But most of the time it happens auditorily. When we're hearing something that we disagree with, we suddenly shut up our ears, stop listening, and start thinking about all the reasons that the speaker is wrong, all the ways that I'm going to skewer and torpedo his or her argument when they're done. And in that amount of time, when we've been completely shut off from what they're saying, we may have totally missed the fact that they were actually articulating a nuance or articulating a counterexample to something that they were going to say in a few moments. So we're ready to go hit them with our counter argument, and we're exhibiting this bad habit. We're listening in order to react or respond, not in order to understand. That's what I want to encourage. We should listen in order to understand. So Jacob says we stop listening and begin thinking of all the ways the speaker is wrong. His advice is very simple. He says, try listening fully, and then before you respond at all, give it 10 minutes. Why? Well, because if somebody says something that pisses you off, it's going to take you 5 to 10 minutes to have all of that emotional reaction that's going on physiologically that stops you, like literally stops you, psychologically, chemically measurable, stops you from being able to think rationally. If you give it about 10 minutes, you might realize that the thing that you were ticked off about might not be as big of a deal as you thought it was, and you might need not to go hammer on the person with a critique. Do you feel me? Right? So it takes patience in two ways, right? We listen in order to understand, and then when we hear and understand as fully as we can, we give it a few minutes, especially if we feel ourselves becoming angry, right? Anxious, and so on. We have got, I think, in our own tradition, some good resources that will help us do this, right? Listen in order to respond, not react. Listen in order to understand, not react or respond. I would say this is a form of practicing intellectual humility, which many Christian leaders, especially the paragons that we read and look to on the regular for what it means to be a Christian, they exhibited this, and they are a model of it for us. So to draw on a Christian tradition, this phrase in Latin, credo ut intelligam, comes from both St. Augustine and St. Anselm. And the basic idea is I believe in order to understand, or St. Augustine would say it more in a different way, I believe, I have faith seeking understanding. We can go way back before Luther, way back before our own church body and many of its great paragons of theological reflection to the ways of the early church. And they teach us how to engage with others. Simple patience, simple listening, and with a motivation not to react or respond, but to understand. And then have a conversation. Right? It flows out of not trying to bridge ideologies. Right? Sometimes it's worth having a debate. We've got to ask ourselves why we do it. Do I debate to win? Or do I debate for the sake of achieving collectively the truth? Which one should we do? I think you know the answer. Another challenge, we assume motivation. In his book, The Righteous Mind, John Haidt talks about this in terms of the very academic phrase, motivation, attribution, asymmetry. But it's basically like this. Those who disagree with us are worse sorts of people, less intelligent, vile, and not to be associated with. Whereas we, on the other hand, are well-intentioned, rational, and on the side of righteousness. Right? Motivational attribution asymmetry is basically making a monster out of the other and an angel out of myself. Right? And we all know what the basic word assume, what we can do with that, right? When we do that, there's trouble. So, right? And especially when we start to assume this way. There's even more trouble, right? And you can see how it leads to contempt. So the problems with assumptions, we know them. They misconstrue reality, right? I overinflate my sense of self, and I overdeflate who they are to me. That misconstrues reality in a very basic way. It damages relationships because they start to realize that we see them as less than. And it generates situations in which your character is questioned because other people see you assuming motivation. Right? That doesn't mean good things for you. We do that, it's contemptuous. Pretend as if we already know better. And overall, assumptions are generally unproductive. Right? It's better to ask questions and carry out the conversation, even if that takes more time, even if it requires patience. It's better to get at the truth of the matter than to assume and be wrong. Do you feel me? Last, antagonism shapes others' perceptions of us. I think you've heard this before. It's a bit of a cliche, but many cliches are true. We're known more in the church for what we're against than what we are for. And this is the basic question. Is this the witness that we want? Is this the witness that we want? The bigger question, if it's so well known what we're against, how will people know what we are for? How will they know? Right? How will they know, then, the Jesus who is for them if we aren't? How will they know the Jesus that's for them if we aren't? What can we do, especially about that last one, but maybe collectively all of these? I think following Arthur Brooks' title, Love Your Enemies, we should seek to be Christians who are known for our love. Right? Let me be clear about this very quickly. I think we often work, or we're pressured to work, with a handful of category mistakes in our culture. So many people generically will equate love with affirmation. Right? If you really love me, then you're okay with everything about me. Right? And I've encountered that with my college students. Sometimes love is a code word. Sometimes the word welcome, which we want to use all the time, is code. In the LGBTQ population in particular, welcome is code language. Do you understand what I mean by that? No. Welcome means open and affirming. Does that make sense? Okay. So, So I would say this is a category mistake. Right? Love doesn't equal affirmation. I'm a parent. How many of you are parents? Okay, we love our kids, yeah? Do you affirm every darn thing about them? They smart off to you, or, break your things, or run mud through your... No, I don't affirm that. That's bad. That's not a good way to live in this household. That's not a good way to live in your school. That's not going to be a good way to live in your workplace. That's not the kind of household that you want to have when you're older. So we're pushing back on them, right? A flip side, or a corollary, is this. It's often treated in our culture as if disagreement always equals hate. Right? But that's another category mistake. Use the same example, right? I disagree with my kids because I love them, not because I hate them. And in fact, on the basis of many of our friendships, I would disagree with you, and sometimes I disagree with our church because I love it so much. Do you feel me? All right, and then one more, very quickly. A category mistake that creates the culture of contempt is that persons or people equal the ideas or beliefs or convictions that they harbor. Right? So their moral standing in our eyes is derived from whether or not they voted for Trump or they voted for Biden, or they're a Catholic and not a Lutheran, or they're a Michigan State Spartan and not a Wolverine. Right? But people don't equal ideas. Right? We're all fallible, sinful, all of us could be wrong, all of us are on the way. And so are all of those people that God is bringing across your path and wants you to have a relationship with. Okay? So, aim to be Christians who are known for their love. I started with love here just to be clear about what I mean. I think we live in a post-Christian culture that's pluralistic. And all I really mean by that is empirically, we are surrounded by a whole bunch of people who believe differently than we do. Right? I'm not saying pluralistic in the sense that all of those beliefs are true and affirmable. It's just a fact that we all have to wrestle with existing around people who don't think and believe and share our convictions. Not everybody believes and thinks like us. We can look back at the early church and say, I think there's some wisdom we can draw on here. They were in this context, sort of. Here's the difference. You'd have to be living, say, in a major trade cosmopolitan city like Corinth or Rome to be experiencing encounters with people who harbor deeply different convictions from you. If you lived out in the countryside or off of those trade routes, most likely you weren't experiencing it. You experienced a generally homogenized cultural experience. Everybody believed and thought the same. Europe in Luther's day, in general, everybody was a Christian, right? Everybody shared those convictions. How you lived it out, how you judged faithfulness started to become a debate in the 1500s, but frankly, it was much earlier than that. But they shared many things in common. In our time, as we reach into the modern age, I think it's really difficult to imagine an existence, at least something like ours, where we're not constantly bombarded with the fact that there are other sorts of beliefs out there. We can't avoid it. It's around every corner. We may do it interpersonally, but if not, it's on all of the media that we're consuming. It's unavoidable. We're going to encounter it. And I think that's the difference between the early church and ours. The trouble is we can't be nostalgic and think we can go back. Right? There's nothing to go back to. We can't forget the formative historical experience we've lived through, but we can go forward by leaning back on the past, right? We can't be nostalgic because we're an eschatological people. God is always pulling us forward on his trajectory into the future. There's no going back. We can learn from the past. So let me try to show you a little bit. For 1 Peter, classic text that's regularly cited. Who is going to harm you if you're eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Don't be frightened. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Now, this text is classically cited in contemporary apologetics and worldview studies, particularly verse 15, always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have. I think that's an absolutely wrong application of that text, because Peter is trying to address an audience of people who are enduring persecution. They were probably in Rome. We don't know some of the details. But we've got to ask, why would Peter talk this way? What's he really getting at? Am I supposed to just do all of my homework so that I can answer any possible Christian objection that comes up? Well, that's a really convenient verse for apologists and worldview study folks to use, but I think Peter's actually calling us to something different. I think he's calling us to be the question. To be the question. If we live our lives in such a way that it's aimed to be known for our love, people are going to start asking us why you do what you do. Our lives become the question, which then prompts us to be able to give an answer for the hope that we have. Yes? Do you feel me? Okay, another one from Colossians. This is a classic text that we use at LHM. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Well, this is a challenging calling, right? But I think wisdom is embodied in the sense that we try to discern where a person is at, any given person. We treat a person as a concrete individual, as, for example, Bonhoeffer would advise. We treat their situation and their circumstances as concrete. Theirs are theirs, and not mine. We shouldn't treat every situation as if there is a one-size-fits-all principled answer and response that we give to every person who's dealing with, say, divorce. Right? We don't treat them all the same. Their story is different. How they got there, why it happened, and so we have to take the time to listen and get to know them. We've got to develop a sense of trust, that they know we really care. Right? Another wise person that I know said, "Don't tell me what a friend you have in Jesus until you show me what a friend I have in you." Don't tell me what a friend I have in Jesus until you show me what a friend I have in you. I might not actually be able to talk about my faith or even really care about them until I'm being wise about who they are, discerning their spiritual situation, their spiritual posture, we call it at LHM. Right? Let our conversation be full of grace. Paul did this all the time. He addressed Jews differently using their language, and he addressed pagans in a totally different way. Jesus did this too. He was gentle with the widow at Nain. He spoke with boldness to those who were timid but curious, right? And he spoke with, even greater boldness, perhaps to the stubborn Pharisees, right? I don't think we could ever say Jesus was a jerk. I also don't think that any of us could speak to someone who was in that boat of a Pharisee in the same way that Jesus did. At least not without sinning. He's the Son of God. He's the only one who could do it perfect. I found this book to be fascinating. Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World by Tom Holland. Tom Holland is an atheist historian. Writes for popular audiences. He told the last 2,000 years of Christian history in a way I'd never read before. And I wondered, why would an atheist take up this topic? Well, he kind of tells you. He found the history of Christianity so compelling. I don't believe this. I think it's silly, for example, but how could it become such a dominant way of thinking and even being in the world? How could it take over, essentially, the world in such a way, the most predominant religion? Well, what he discovered was, in the book, love, the way that we talk about it, or we should talk about it, as Christians, isn't a sentiment. It isn't what you experience in a Hallmark card. It isn't a warm feeling. It's a social practice. Love isn't a sentiment. It's a social practice. And this is what he records. It's the witness of the saints and the martyrs. It's the witness, the self-sacrificial love that they embodied and exhibited is what grew Christianity into a worldwide religion. It's what continues to do so. And I think in our cultural context, it can do so again. This is Tertullian, from whom we get this famous phrase, "It's mainly the deeds of a love so noble that lead many to put a brand upon us." This is Christians in roughly the 3rd century. See how they love one another. That was their social reputation. I think Holland's story gives me hope that this could be our reputation again. But I don't think it's that right now. I don't think we're known for our love. But we could be. We're known We are, in the eyes of people who perceive the church, we are who we have been. We are who we've been, but we don't have to stay that way. Jesus invites us, come as you are. But he doesn't let us stay that way. Right? So aim to be Christians for their love. Let me go back to those challenges and approaches. The first one, slightly out of order here, take time to truly listen, because it humanizes the other. Refrain from assuming motivation. Rather, assume that everyone else is greater than you and you are least of all. This is Paul's admonishment to us. Right? Bridge relationships, not ideological gaps. I gave you a reminder. And narrate what you're for. That is, we are for others. And live it out. Right? Jesus talks about his own existence as being that way, for others. So Bonhoeffer and St. Paul, I like to smash them together to really kind of get at this idea. Right? Who are we for? We are for others. Bonhoeffer called Jesus the quintessential man for others. St. Paul said in Galatians 2, verse 20, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Well, if Christ is the man for others and he lives in me, that makes us people for others. It's very simple to articulate. It's very difficult without the help of God to live. Do you feel me? All right. And then learn from Jesus. Like I said at the beginning, I say it again now, he never let an issue prevent a relationship. Let me close with an example, and then I'll do a little bit of Q&A. This is from John chapter 4, story of the woman at the well, but it's a paraphrase. Once upon a time, there was a woman who came to draw water from a well. There at the well when she arrived was a man. The man and the woman were of very distinct ethnicities, and their people never associated with one another. It's as if they were sworn enemies by default, even though the two of them had never met, and no personal conflict existed between them. The woman seemed to recognize this most clearly, knowing simply upon seeing the man that he was one of them. The barrier of hostility between their peoples made her hesitant to engage. Still, it came to be that the man received a drink of water from the woman, for he had been weary from traveling, was thirsty. This simple act of kindness led on to a conversation. At one point, the man invited the woman to call for her husband. I have no husband, she said. Surprisingly, the man acknowledged the truthfulness of the woman's statement, revealing with his unexplainable knowledge that he was no ordinary man. He continued, the fact is you've had 5 husbands, and the man you are with is indeed not your husband. Stunned, the woman responded, saying, I can see that you are a prophet. But the man was more than that. Their conversation meandered back into the historical circumstances that engendered the differences and the divisions between their peoples. And along the way, the woman silently struggled to discern who this man really was, for she knew she was engaged in conversation with someone very special. Finally, the man described a future when the differences between their peoples wouldn't matter. In fact, the differences and divisions between all peoples would indeed be transcended by something that all people have in common. Suddenly, the woman felt that the conversation was becoming too esoteric, too complicated for someone like her and this man to discuss. The mysteries they were considering would, she thought, eventually be explained when the Messiah comes. Now, the Messiah, her people believed, was God's chosen one, who would really heal and save the world, and certainly he would undo the effects of the differences and the divisions between their peoples, not only theirs, but all people. Yet the woman found it difficult to believe she could be talking, in fact, to the Messiah himself. It was at that moment that the man said, I who speak with you am he. Before she could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the man's friends, who had gone into the town where the woman lived to buy food. Upon their arrival, the woman left, returning to her town. Along the way, she was deep in thought about what she had just experienced. Overcome with a sense of urgency and awe from the experience, she began telling other townsfolk to come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this man be the Messiah? In fact, many of the townsfolk went out to meet the man, And they too were so moved by their engagements with him that they invited the man to stay in their town for a while, despite the differences between their people. And over time, they too came to believe he was the Messiah. I use this because it's just one biblical example of how Jesus didn't let issues prevent relationships. Because she had a lot of issues. Yes? And so do we. Romans 5 says, while we were still his enemies, Christ came for our salvation. Thank God that Jesus doesn't let issues prevent relationships. Because you or I wouldn't be here if he did. Think of Nicodemus. Think of Zacchaeus. Think of his interaction with the centurions. Think even of his interactions with the stubborn Pharisees. He may have completely disagreed, said woe to them on a regular basis. But if you know Jesus, you know that it was always in hope that they'd come around. It's almost as if at the end of the story of the two lost sons, or the prodigal son as we sometimes know it, Jesus starts off talking to two different audiences there. And I think this is the best way to interpret that whole story. 3 parables in a row. Jesus is talking to scribes and the teachers of the law and sinners, tax collectors on the other side. Each audience represents one of the sons. And at the end of the story, Jesus is standing there with his arms wide open, welcoming both of them, as he does for all of us. May we live out that same thing for everyone we encounter. Thank you so much for hearing me out. I've got enough time for questions and answers, and I also have a variety of other resources. Spiritual Conversation Curve Cards. It's just a small sample of what we do at LHM to whet your appetite. Come and see more. Visit our website. I would love to come or send a member of my team to visit you in your districts or congregations. Frankly, we are even game to do something virtually. I'm not sure that any of us want to do any more of that, but we would. My colleagues here would also love to chat with you. We've got more stuff at our booth, but I'll just stop and say, what questions do you have? Please.
How do you respond when the contempt comes at you? Like you are trying to bridge a conversation, let's say with a neighbor or somebody that you work with. But then I'm a pastor's wife, and so people will just put me in a box.
Yes.
I must be like that, and the contempt will come at me.
Yes. Have we all not been traumatized by this exact sort of thing at some point in our life? Right? It's one of the most painful things that we as humans have to endure, the way that we treat each other. How do you respond? Prayerfully, with patience, by swallowing your pride, repenting when you fail at doing it well, and trying to show them that maybe how they imagine you isn't the right way. Instead of telling them, one of my colleagues at Lutheran Hour said, I'm not going to tell them, I'm going to show them. And man, if I could be like him in his patience, I so want to embody how he treats others. I so want to emulate that. I'm jealous how often I fail, right? So I'm sinning twice. I'm jealous and I fail. Yeah. There's no good answer. There's only a hard response to that question, but it's an incredibly hard question.
Going off of a similar, I think the same thing where I've been, COVID has offered a whole new set of divisive matters.
Yep.
And I've been on the receiving end of trying to have a peaceful conversation, well, trying to receive what someone is trying to convince me of in a conversation I never wanted to get into in the first place, and followed by many acts of convincing. I mean, you just can't get it to stop.
Yeah.
I agree with trying to bridge the relationship. I also feel like I have to say, I need this part to stop. But I'm trying to figure out how to,
Yeah.
I don't know whether to just ignore and hope they catch on, or to address it.
I'm trying to practice being better So I'm often ready to have a pushback sort of answer, right? We can always run evidence against evidence, for example, and we've been doing it all of COVID. But I'm starting to try to do something different, ask questions. Tell me more. Tell me why you think that. Let me hear more of your position in hopes that if I allow them to express that and I demonstrate to them a kind of warmth and openness to hearing what they have to say, they might reciprocate. They might get at the small glimpse of where I'm coming from. At other times, I just try to say, tell me your story. You know, where do you come from? So Megan and I know each other. We served at Concordia University in Portland together. We really dealt with the challenge of the LGBTQ group of students that were very militantly against some of the things that our synod believes, teaches, and confesses. And they wanted us ultimately to reject that. And synod was the other way. It was almost a zero-sum game between the two groups. And we were utterly convinced that we didn't have to follow either of those paths. And so I spent time with these students, and I would just ask them, tell me your story. Right? Because a lot of us have opinions about the them over there, and it might be the them in terms of the LGBTQIA, et cetera, population. Right? For many of us, they're them. They're scary. It's an issue that prevents a relationship. And I just tried to not let it. I tried to start with the relationship. They knew that I couldn't say yes to what they wanted me to say yes to. They knew that I wouldn't. But by the end, they knew that they mattered to me as a person. And I think that's trying to live more like Jesus, right? Just as an example. COVID has been the same for so many of you who are trying to think about how best to make prudent decisions to lead a great community of people that you're responsible for. And some of you are even speaking into the lives of the leaders who are doing that. And none of us had good answers. One of the things I think we've wrestled with this whole pandemic is to realize that science doesn't give us certainty. But we've expected it to forever. Because why? I go to the eye doctor and they prescribe me glasses and, well, golly, I can actually see you better, you know? And we experience regularly good outcomes that we can build more and more knowledge on from science. But in the midst of this pandemic, we've found out, just as has long been known, right, that they don't have all the answers. We've expected too much, right? I still want to know if eggs are good for you. I've been wondering that since I was in elementary school. Because every science book or health textbook or television told me something different, right? And so we're all really frustrated because what we're experiencing is what God often teaches us. Life is uncertain, and we're not in control of our existence. This has been a huge teaching to our whole culture. Maybe it's an opportunity to speak into it. Maybe it's a crack in the secular dome where God is maybe breaking through to give us an opportunity to put our trust in some place than ourselves. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
You mentioned your conflict or kind of being stuck in the middle for the LGBT community and the synod. Would you say that you were able to, or it sounds like you were able to kind of make it work where you said, I'm trying to follow Jesus, I love you as a person, but I still have to hold on to this disagreement?
I made it work for me. I don't know that I convinced anybody else, but I didn't care about that. Nobody had to do it my way. That wasn't my agenda. My agenda was try to care for these students. Because as a pastor, they were my flock. These are the people that God has brought to me. And there's no reason that they can't get an education here. There's no reason that I can't associate with them and love them, even if we harbor deep differences. I try to make every classroom an opportunity to live that out, to actually embody the conversations that are difficult and hard. I don't think that there's any place after college where we can safely do that anywhere in our culture right now. Social media certainly isn't that place. But I could try to create an atmosphere in my classrooms where that would happen. And somehow, some way, I was at least successful enough that students started to trust me. I really think God was reaching down through heaven to do something that I didn't really know how to do. But I was just trying and fumbling and muddling through to try to do. And maybe I achieved some success. But I don't know that I influenced a whole bunch of other people to think differently or do it my way. Does that make sense? Does that help?
That Ted would watch and witness this. That was one of the people that could then the strongly opinionated over here who would dehumanize this side, the strongly opinionated over here who would dehumanize that side. And I know you're not asking for this, but Chad was the bridge of saying, no, everyone's human here, and we're all kind of messed up people, so I just want to know who you are as a person. It felt like sanity.
I started,
Pretty insane
yeah.
situation.
I like to sometimes use this phrase, I started with a politics of sameness. Sameness being we're all created in the image of God. Sameness being we're all fallen creatures. Your fallenness might be different than mine, but the image of God is not. Not at all. Right? That's a bridge. Right? That's first article stuff. Right? First article of the creed. God created all things.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think lately for me, expectations have been really important. So like, if I'm going to enter into a disagreement with somebody I know, like I think it's helpful to talk with them in advance and like set the stage of saying, hey, I would like to like disagree with you and talk about this, but just so you know, not to the extent of our relationship breaking.
Yeah.
But like having that conversation beforehand, like just, I don't know, set the stage and say, hey, I do love you through this. So.
Yep. Good. Thank you. Sure.
Do you think that there should be a different way that we talk and treat other people when their ideas may be more harmful compared to not? Meaning like, if people are a Lions fan, I'll probably won't treat them different. But if someone is a racist, that's a much more potentially harmful when we go about that.
It is. Yeah, I agree. There are some things that start to call upon us to take responsibility for in order to protect other people. But how we handle that, I think, and how we talk is the really big challenge. That's why I said I think Jesus was the only one ever able to do this perfectly. Because every time we do it, we might harbor in the back of our minds that I'm on the side of righteousness and I'm an anti-racist and that makes me good. And so that also validates my argumentativeness with people who disagree with me, right? And it may frame a certain kind of approach where I'm feeling good about myself. It's that motivation attribution asymmetry that I mentioned a few minutes ago. I don't know that there's any universal approach that I could prescribe. I think it's based on the people that you encounter. You have to take the time to treat them concretely as a human being with their own story who came to view the things that they view in this particular moment through a lifetime's worth of a journey up until that day. But no, they might not continue that way. One, because we're fallible, and two, we don't know a great many things. Three, we don't know what we don't know very often. Right? But we've got to address them as the person they are, not just say, I'm going to handle every racist this way. I don't know what, frankly, not all Lutherans are the same. Right? We're not a homogenous group. Racists aren't a homogenous group. Black people don't all love Black Lives Matter. Right? LGBTQ people don't all want the church to become open and affirming. Once you start to learn that there are dissenters in every group, you start to see that every group is not homogenous. It's difficult then to start calling them groups, right? Because they even harbor minuscule differences amongst themselves. And we've got to be sensitive to that. And that's why I say treat them as a concrete person in a concrete situation, circumstances, past history, a story. That takes time. But I think there is no other place where real ministry happens than there. You feel me? Yeah.
I'm just curious on your approach, kind of going along with that. You said you're a dad and you have children, like how much you want some of those different groups and say where you maybe leading your children astray in a certain way, or how you kind of, are you kind of like, hey, let's hang out more at these groups as a father, or are you just kind of talk about that a little bit as a parental side and young children that maybe not know there?
Yep. I am, again, going to handle the situations as they come. I don't have a plan because I don't know what to expect. I live in a certain part of the country where there are certain pressures that don't exist on my kids, whereas if I lived still in Portland, Oregon, a great many pressures would exist in a completely different way, but minus the ones that they have now. Does that make sense? So I think all of us have to sensitively parent as faithful as we possibly can to the situation at hand, to the child at hand. And I think all of us probably know this. I'm not in control of where my kid ends up. And whether she thinks and agrees with me, or I'm not even in control of whether or not she completely abandons it. I converted from atheism in my freshman year of college, but the family situation that I grew up in was one where faith didn't matter. There was no stickiness to my faith formation, even though I was raised and confirmed Roman Catholic. There's no reason for it to shape my identity into the future. All the sociological data says I should be out of the kingdom. It's kind of where my siblings are. My parents didn't intentionally set out for the outcome that I would not be a faithful person, but they didn't really invest in the outcome that I would be. Even if they had no control of where I would be. But my story is interesting because it's the exact opposite of what you would expect. And my folks really didn't have all that much to do with it. God does what God does, right? So that's just my story of how I came to faith, but I think it's applicable to formation of children on just about everything, right? I can do my darndest, and I think we're all going to. But where they end up, I have to release that into the hands of God. And when that day comes, that's going to be hard for me. I can say it, right? Sounds great, makes real good sense right now. Yeah, we're all like, mm-hmm. But, the day that I'm going to have to do it, I'm probably going to be, calling you up and crying or something like, please help me. I won't know how to handle it. I might be a complete and total wreck. I don't know. Yeah.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer has the term cheap grace.
He does.
How does that apply to our lives in the ministry?
Why do you ask, and what do you mean by cheap grace? What do you think he means by that?
Well, there's a couple different examples in the nutshell. One is you said you ask forgiveness, but you don't give back the car.
You don't give back the
You don't give back the stolen car.
Okay.
You don't make it right. And the other one is we can be disingenuous in our relationships with others about Christ and the way we approach them, the inequality that we have before us that we never bridge. Does that make sense?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
I'm trying to kind of follow along. When I think of Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, or sometimes just called Discipleship in German, he talks about it as autobiographical. About he is reflecting on faith. It's almost the sort of book that you would read as he's writing theology as a devotional experience. It's an outcome of his devotional life. Does that make sense? So, St. Anselm, we get from him the ontological argument for the existence of God, right? He's the greatest possible being that we can imagine, therefore God exists, right? But Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica, right? The five ways are also 5 arguments for the existence of God. I think a lot of scholars are realizing that many of those guys who wrote theology were writing it as a devotional experience, not to teach. Luther died and thought everything should be burned of his that he wrote except Bondage of the Will. Right? He thought that was the only thing worth salvaging. So when you kind of understand behind the scenes the way the author understood his own text, I think that demands for us to try to understand that text in a similar way. And there's still debate about it because Bonhoeffer died, martyred, before he could tell us a lot of the things that many of us scholars of Bonhoeffer want to know. So that's why I'm struggling to understand what you mean by cheap grace and what you're trying to ask me. I don't even know if I've helped by saying any of this out loud. I want to. And maybe you and I can talk a little more after, and you can just try to, work. We can dialogue, and I can understand better what you're asking. Okay? Yeah, I'd be glad to. Anybody else? Wow. I'm really pleased that you came. It's really a privilege for me to be able to do this. I enjoy it very much. If you want my card, I've got some. Talk to my colleagues. God bless you all. I know you've worked really hard. I hope this ministry has been a blessing to you here. I know this church does this for that very reason, especially now, post-COVID. Go back to your ministries renewed, revitalized. You are in callings that matter. You are doing things that make an eternal difference, right? That's where we rest. God's put you there.